Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from the great state of Texas is Conrad Bibens. Conrad, how are you today?
Very, very good. Thank you for having me.
Delighted to have you with us. Now, this is the week of the anniversary of the Battle of Nashville, and Conrad is the author of a new novel about George Henry Thomas, who had been commanding at Nashville. And the name of the novel is The Best General of the Civil War. Conrad, that is a big, bold claim for your title.
Yeah, I threw it out there just as an attention grabber. I would presume it would cause a lot of discussion and debate among Civil War scholars or Civil War buffs, and that's fine. I kind of wanted to have a little debate.
So, what attracted you to George Henry Thomas in the first place?
Well, I'm originally from St. Joseph, Missouri, but for about 3 years I lived in Memphis, Tennessee. And at one time I was going to a grocery store with a friend, and I nearly bumped into this gentleman, and he walked away. And my friend said, "Don't you know who that was? That was Shelby Foote." And at that time, I had no idea who he was because this is several years before he became a PBS superstar. And my friend was saying, "Well, you need to read him because he wrote this great history of the Civil War." And since Memphis, there's a lot of things going on still in the Civil War about what to do with the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. So, okay, I started reading Foote, and I thought, wow, he's a wonderful writer. Of course, he's a very good novelist as well. And I finally just figured, okay, the most interesting person to me was George Thomas, because as you know, he was born in Virginia. He was the son of slaveholders and very good friends with Robert E. Lee. But he decided when the South seceded from the Union that he was going to go with the North, that he, respected the Constitution more than he did, a Southern pride or whatever. And he, like I say, had owned slaves, but I think he was deciding that slavery was wrong. Part of it was that because he had married a northern woman from upstate New York, and I think that had to have some influence on him. Though he and his wife both denied that she pushed him into being loyal to the Union, but still, it was he just seemed like a very interesting, fascinating person because the South hated him for his stand. His family basically disowned him, but he just kept going. And he became, some people would rate him, the third or fourth best general at the North had in the Civil War. And I think in some ways he's better than Grant or Thomas, but that's just my opinion, just after reading about him all this time.
Better than Grant or Lee, you mean?
Yeah, yes, I would think better than them, just because oh, he didn't waste men's lives to the same degree that Grant and Lee did at certain places, and he was a little more careful about things. Some would call him slow, and I don't think that's right. I think he was deliberate, but he was careful, and um, I think he was more interested in winning the battle, you know, efficiently rather than just, sending men in just to, storm barricades one more time. He was, like I say, more deliberate, more tactical and strategic in what he was doing. Uh, I think if I've never been a soldier, but if I was going to be a soldier, I'd rather Thomas be my commander than Grant, certainly. So again, that's just my opinion after reading many books about the Civil War and about 5 biographies of Thomas.
Now, was your encounter with Shelby Foote at the supermarket, was that your first kind of brush with the Civil War, or were you interested in the Civil War studies before then?
Well, I mean, I I'd read about it obviously, in high school and grade school and history classes and in college, but it being in Memphis is like I say, it was a lot more of a present thing, and where I was from in Missouri and Kansas, it was the Civil War is pretty vicious too, but it was mostly guerrilla warfare, and we nobody really wanted to talk about it that much because it just um, people are kind of ashamed of it in some ways, I think. But in Tennessee and Mississippi and Arkansas, that part of the tri-state area where I was living for a while was people thought a lot more about it. Of course, Shiloh was close by and some other places. So I, yeah, I became a lot more aware of the Civil War. And again, reading Shelby Foote and then going on from him, reading Bruce Catton's histories and so forth. That and just it became something like I thought about a lot more. And because you know, in Memphis, they did have this, big statue of equestrian statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he was buried there, right in the heart of Memphis, and that was in the early 1980s. And as African Americans gained more power in Memphis, they were thinking, we really don't want this here anymore. I mean, he was, Forrest was a great soldier, but he was, you know, a slave dealer before the war. He his forces massacred some black Union soldiers during the war, and then after the war, he became a Ku Klux Klan leader. So eventually, that statue went away. So history is an ongoing thing. I mean, the who was it? Faulkner said, history is not dead; it's not even past. The past is not dead. And here, the all these names that of American forts have been changed. Fort Bragg and Fort Hood, which is good because they were named after Confederate leaders who, however your politics are, I would think you would have to consider them traitors to the United States, and they were bad generals overall, so they lost a lot. So anyway. And Thomas, I don't think there's that much name for George Thomas, and I wish there was more name for him because he seemed like he was a man who was, uh, I think, would be a good example to the 21st century. He,
Certainly a man of principle if he decided to stick with his military commission during secession, and there's a lot of pressure from his family for him to go with the South, and he didn't. And that's a really tough personal spot to find oneself in. And I'm sure you had to kind of spend some time kind of getting into his head to think about that. Um, how do you think he navigated that really difficult choice?
well, it was as I say in the book, and I think I hope I'm been fair to him and try to reflect what I think he would really have said and thought. But it was a slow evolution for him because, like I said, his family owned slaves. Apparently, he was friendly with the slaves. He was not cruel or anything. And I think apparently by the standards of that time, his family was fairly civilized in their treatment of their slaves. But still, when he was 15 years old, he was almost killed by Nat Turner during Nat Turner's rebellion, which was about 1831. That's where Nat Turner was a slave who was also a preacher, and about 70 of his followers rebelled and went across southern Virginia, killing about 60 or 70 white people, and before they were finally subdued. But they came to uh, George Thomas's family farms plantation, and he and his family were barely able to escape. And but the slaves they had at their plantation uh, stayed loyal to the family. I guess because, as I said, they treated them, fairly civilized, and they escaped from Turner. The slaves escaped from Turner as fast as they could. So I think Thomas, well, just thought, okay, I can understand why uh, Turner would want to be free, why he would want to rebel. But I think he also appreciated the fact that the slaves that they owned were not killers, that they were also civilized people. And I think that gave him a lot more insight into why slavery is wrong. And it wasn't like he immediately became an abolitionist, but I think he uh, truly truly saw that okay, this is not working. This is going to have to change. So so I think that was part of why he stayed loyal to the Union.
Now, you had decided to approach this novel from Thomas's first person perspective, which is a pretty daunting challenge to adopt someone's first person perspective as a historical figure. Tell me about that choice, and your decision to write in Thomas's voice.
It just seemed more fun for one thing. Among other things, I just wanted to be entertaining. I thought, okay, well, first off, I have to entertain myself. And I just thought, we can all kind of put ourselves sometimes in someone else's mind, like, what, how would I be? And like I said, I've never been a soldier. I don't have his courage or anything, but uh, at toward the end of his life, he was still kind of getting uh, sniped at by his fellow Northern generals who were, I think, a little bit jealous of him, including Grant. And he, and for the like at the end of his life, people were actually uh, saying that, well, Nashville wasn't that big a deal, that anybody could have won that battle because the forces under Hood were John Bell Hood were kind of they were weakened by the earlier Battle of Franklin, and I think it was John Scofield who was one of the guys who was trying to knock Thomas down a peg. And I think the idea is okay. Thomas was about to write a letter to the New York Tribune, which is published an earlier letter that tried to negate his Battle of Nashville. So I thought, okay, while he's trying to gather himself to write this letter, he'll just kind of start narrating his life to his wife. He was trying to explain himself and trying to get all his thoughts in order. And okay, he'll just tell his story to his wife. And in a way, I kind of wanted it to be that Thomas was venting. He wasn't trying to be diplomatic or whatever. He wasn't trying to write an official autobiography that would be published in his lifetime and where he'd try to maybe settle scores, but in a more of a civilized, dignified way. It was like he was mad, he was peeved, and sometimes you can vent to your wife that you would not in ways that you would not vent to anybody else. So I kind of went along those lines.
Yeah, that's actually what I love about George Gordon Mead's memoirs. If you read those, and his letters, he's writing to his wife, and he's just writing to his life partner and venting, and it's a much different tone than his letters to other people. So I think that's a pretty neat convention for you to adopt with Thomas. Yeah. Did you have to read a bunch of his stuff to kind of get his voice?
I I read about 5 biographies of him. 2 of them are fairly recent, and one by Benson Bobrick and another by Brian Steele. But there were quotes from him from some of the documents he wrote, and he was uh, pretty formal language, but he wasn't too flowery or florid or whatever. Um, he was pretty down to earth. And there are some other quotes that some of the people who knew him would remember. And so he had he was, like I say, he was pretty self-effacing. For a general, he was relatively not that vain, but he did have a very, oh, hidden sense of humor as well. So,
Mm.
um, so from reading these biographies, I hoped I got the sense of how he would speak and how he would express himself. I think, um, like I say, that there are several biographies that are all pretty good, including one from the 19th century. But and of course, you can get a lot of his style sometimes just by reading the general biographies, including Shelby Foote and Bruce Catton and oh, I can't remember the name of the author who wrote the Battle Cry of Freedom about.
Oh, James McPherson. Yep.
Excuse me.
James McPherson.
That's right, right. He's also that was a wonderful book as well. So
So, and you present the novel as though these are, um, papers of Thomas that have been discovered in a stash of papers at Troy University.
mhm.
Tell us a little bit about kind of that convention that you chose.
uh, in a way, it was inspired by George MacDonald Fraser, who wrote the Flashman novels, which is a, a packet of papers about this fictional Victorian hero of the British Empire, who was uh, he was in all these different adventures, and of course unlike Thomas, this guy was of course fictional, but he's also a coward and a rogue. But he always managed to take credit for things and managed somehow to survive to prosper later on. But the whole conceit of that of those books were that okay, these were just packets discovered years after he died, and you know, and he's being extremely frank about himself. I thought, okay, well, that's good. That's a good concept. Maybe I can borrow it and just try to write in that style, at least. And I try to, make sure. Of course, this book is my book is labeled a novel, but there are some people who, when they read the introduction by the editor of these Thomas papers, thought, well, Conrad, how do you find these papers? What, they I'm going to take it as a compliment that at least I wrote it so well if I took them in, but I guess I should have put in the prologue something like, this is a novel. I make stuff up. You know, it's based on fact, and I didn't make up, um, facts of what he did and on the days that he did them. But obviously a lot of the conversations and his thought process was, from my own imagination.
Uh,
So,
no Troy University, what Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute's there in Troy, but
yeah, that's the only school I know of. I don't think the state university system has a campus in Troy, and if there is, I apologize to it. But,
but Troy, of course, being where he's buried, his wife's family was from there. That's where he
but,
ended up settling after the war. So, kind of a neat connection if you know Thomas's life story. Um,
it was just the funeral was held there in Troy, so at the church where the papers were supposedly found.
and he's got a beautiful, beautiful gravesite up there. So if you folks visit that today. Now, as you prepared to write this novel, and you said you've read a lot of biographies, you've read a lot of his reports and things that he's written. What's your overall impression of Thomas, both pros and cons?
Well, I'll go with the cons first. He was, um, yes, he was perhaps a little bit too deliberate. I think he was a little. There were chances he had for promotion that he turned down because they didn't match his respect for the chain of command. He thought he didn't want to intrigue against other officers. And there are times you're like, you wish, George, come on, you know you're better than this guy. Take the job, you know, don't be so, persnickety about it. And I think he was perhaps is a bit of a snob toward know, some people, and including I think Grant. I think he didn't think much of Grant. I guess because obviously Grant had his problems before the war with uh, liquor and so forth. And I think Thomas, like a lot of people, just didn't think Grant was as good as he should have been. So I think there's that. But as far as his pros go, um, he's definitely a man of integrity. Maybe too much integrity because, like I said, he should have taken promotions quicker than he did. But he he could evolve in his thinking because he, like I say, he was the son of slaveholders, but he eventually came to realize, okay, slavery is wrong, and I shouldn't be fighting for this. And you know, in his conduct of the war, he was able to improvise quite often. He had this reputation for being slow and just being a defensive soldier, but when opportunities came to go on the offensive, he could be very quick when he had to be. So I think that was uh, to his credit. And you know, and a lot of it also was because he was slighted quite often. Uh, he didn't he wasn't a prima donna about it. He was okay. This is the idea is okay. We're going to win the war, and I'm not going to you know get hysterical about my lost opportunities. I'm just going to do what I have to do to help win the war, and I respect that a lot. So,
Now, you'd mentioned some of the conflicts he has with Grant, kind of button heads a little bit there. He also has a lot of problems with John Scofield. You alluded to that a little bit earlier, but Scofield's someone who kind of is a real problematic figure in Thomas's life and career, not just at Nashville, but kind of before and afterwards. And people tend to kind of know about the Grant Thomas tension, but they overlook this Schofield one, which I think is just as problematic for Thomas in the long term.
they had problems going back years before because when Scofield was a cadet at West Point and Thomas was an instructor, uh, Scofield was almost kicked out because he allowed apparently some students to write uh, vulgar jokes and pictures on the chalkboard in the classroom.
Mm.
And that by today's standards, that's not the worst thing in the world, but it wasn't good. And apparently there was a vote by 5 or so instructors like, should we kick Scofield out of West Point for this, for allowing this to happen? And Thomas voted to remove him from school. And there's no way that, or there should have been no way that Scofield would have learned of this, but I think probably Scofield knew of it, and so he had a grudge against Thomas. And when they finally got together again, where Scofield was serving under Thomas during the Atlanta campaign, and of course later on during the during the Nashville campaign, Scofield was always just trying to, kind of intrigue against him, trying to get more troops away from Thomas so that he could have them. And he was, I think there was definitely jealousy of Scofield against Thomas. And, Thomas just thought, well, Scofield was too slow, for one thing, which is kind of ironic because Thomas was considered too slow by some people. And I think Thomas thought Scofield was not that courageous. Also, a lot of the generals in the Civil War, Thomas included, would try to be close to the front to actually see what's going on. And Scofield usually was really trying to hang back, especially in the Battle of Franklin, because it was a horrendous battle. The Confederates kept trying to storm these barricades, but Scofield wasn't there. He was 2 miles away, with the reserve forces. So now Thomas knew this, and he just he never had any respect for Scofield. So, and after the war, Scofield was the one who's, he denied it, but he, um, so during just before the battle, Scofield was trying to intrigue to try to get the command from Thomas, and he was, Grant almost gave it to him. Then going back after the war, Scofield supposedly was writing this one letter to the New York Tribune that said, "Hey, Franklin was the real victory. Nashville wasn't that important." And well, just about all of Thomas's soldiers were, angry at this, and several of them wrote letters defending Thomas, saying, "Hey, Thomas is the guy who won this battle. Scofield was, not that much." So,
Yeah, I mean, Thomas was someone his troops really, really liked and respected and admired him.
Yeah, he was, one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that he was in terrible pain most of the war because he had wrenched his back, uh, coming out of a train. He fell down an embankment. This is just as the war was beginning. So he was in terrible pain from his back all this time. That may have been maybe one of the reasons he was perhaps a little deliberate in his actions, so he could still ride a horse and do whatever he needed to do. But he was, he had to overcome a lot, just physically as well as mentally to be as successful as he was during this war. Even though, as I said, well, Jeb Stuart had promised that if he ever caught George Thomas, he'd hang him. Which, okay, that's a real threat. And like I say, Thomas's two of his sisters who were still running the plantation where he grew up on, they completely disowned him. The legend is they had his picture on the wall, and they turned his face to the wall, and after the war, when the two sisters were poor because they no longer had slaves to do their work, Thomas tried to help them out by sending them money, and they refused it. They never forgave him. So.
Wow. Tell me your assessment of his big moment. If anybody knows anything about Thomas, it's as the Rock of Chickamauga and his defense there to allow a safe withdrawal of the army at that battle. And so he's become the stuff of legends as a result. Tell me your take on that episode and kind of your takeaways from it.
Well, that was a battle that were about 1/3 of the Union Army basically skedaddled. The Confederates got lucky; they found a gap in the Union line, and like I say, at least 1/3 of the Union Army just ran back toward Chattanooga. But the forces under Thomas, he was able to keep them in line, and they kept the Confederates from turning what was a very bad defeat for the Union, and kept them from making it into a complete catastrophe for the Union. And he was able to keep his men there. I think he just was a good example for his own calmness under fire. And of course, the men under his command were pretty well trained, and they had set up good barricades, and they just held back the South. And they, I think it was supposedly James Garfield, the future president, tried to get to Thomas's forces to say, "Hey, go ahead and withdraw. Come back to Chattanooga. All is lost." And then he got there and he saw that Thomas had the situation. It was still nip and tuck, but he was had the situation under control fairly well. And Garfield sent back a message to the rest of the Union forces saying, Thomas is standing like a rock. And, if you all come back, we can still win this battle. Well, the rest of the Union forces did not come back. That was Rosecrans and those people, including Phil Sheridan. They were all, basically run away, like, you know, from the Monty Python movie, run away, run away. So they'd all went, and Thomas just stood there like a rock. And that became his nickname, is, from James Garfield, the future president. So,
Uh,
and,
so, and as you decided to kind of write about this larger than life character, you talked about, reading a bunch of stuff. You chose to write a novel rather than a traditional biography. Tell me about that choice. Why did you choose to write this in novel form?
because there already had been some good biographies of them. And okay, why go that route? It's already, when it's already been done well. Thought, well, a novel might be more fun, and I I could, as I think, as Gore Vidal said, who wrote some great historic novels, says, a novelist can be as careful or as careless with the facts as he wants to be. Well, I was trying to be very careful with the facts, but I could have fun with it. And I think, uh, with the history, it's like, okay, you gotta say, you can't go into the thought process of the principles very well. You just have to maybe imagine it, but you can't go too far with it. With a novel, you can go all the way if you want. So, and like I say, there already had been like two good biographies just written, I think, this century. So go a different route if I could.
Yeah. And you have a long writing career of your own. So, I mean, you've got some chops that you brought to this project as a writer. Tell us a little bit about your background as a writer, as a journalist, as someone who's been a wordsmith your whole professional career.
Yeah, well, I'm not so much a writer, though I've written a lot of things, but I was mostly as a copy editor and a wire editor for newspapers. And I did it for more than 40 years. When I started off, I was a sports writer, and then a regular reporter, and then a city editor. And then I got into copy editing, and I liked it, which is basically trying to fix other people's mistakes, try to catch them as much as you can, and sometimes improve the writing. And um, worked at a few newspapers, including in Memphis, Tennessee. But for nearly 30 years, I was at the Houston Chronicle, and had a had a good career there. At least I was, retired about 7 years ago, and I'd already written a first draft of this novel about the turn of the century. But when I retired, I thought, okay, now I have the time to really be serious about this. And but I wrote a few book reviews, among other things, when I was at the Chronicle. And I think, reading other books, and of course, there's some very good reporters at the Houston Chronicle, and so you learn something from them, and you learn from the other editors. And so there's a bunch of different experiences I had just in the writing process, mainly editing, but sometimes writing. And I think it did help me quite a bit to get into this. And then, you read there's some good, some great Civil War novels also. I mean, the Killer Angels by Michael Scher, and Shelley Foote actually wrote a rather good Civil War novel, and some other novels that, so it's all like, okay, they're good. They're good. And I don't know how much rubbed off on me. I hope a little bit, but it's like, you try to, you respect what they do, and say, okay, well, let me make a few stabs at this and see what happens.
Yeah. What advice would you offer anybody who's a writer an editor who's working on Civil War stuff?
On what's kind of
On
stuff?
Civil War stuff.
Civil War stuff. Uh, Read the books. There's so many, huge library. I mean, and I've read out of 100 Civil War books probably in the last 30 or 40 years, and nearly all of them are worth reading. and they were all entertaining. And when I got into, okay, I'm going to do this thing on Thomas, I made a point of visiting some of the battlefields, and you know, sometimes my wife and daughters would get really tired of going to Civil War battlefields, but they were patient with me, so thank them for that. And, um, I actually got to Southern Virginia once, and I drove by the farm where George Thomas was born and where he grew up, which is it's a private home. It's still a working farm, and I think they've probably changed the architecture a little bit, but it, wow, it's like it's right there, and they have a historic marker close by, and I'm glad Virginia remembers him a little bit in a positive way, and they do so much for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, or whatever. I'm glad they did a little bit for the guy who was actually loyal to the Union, and then about a mile away is another historic marker for Nat Turner, which the Nat Turner's rebellion started only a couple of miles away from where George Thomas grew up. So it's all connected, So uh, it was the research is great, the reading is great. Sometimes going there just it helps. The thing is, of course, all these Civil War battlefields are now beautiful sites. Now they're pretty well preserved. The trees are green, the grass is growing, and of course, they were all just horrible places during the actual battle. Just everything torn up, and of course the suffering. So it's good to see this, but in the same way, it's like, okay, this isn't reality. The reality was what happened, back in 1863 or 1864, and it wasn't beautiful. So you'd have to kind of keep that in perspective.
Yeah, I always find that juxtaposition just to be a sublime experience to get out there and see how beautiful it is and know how horrible it was. And
Yeah.
you touch on something real quick as we get ready to wrap up about,
Okay.
Virginia does have a historic sign up there, but Thomas generally gets overlooked. He's remembered less fondly than some other generals. Why do you think that is?
Well, um, he died fairly young. He died only about 5 years after the Civil War, and he so of course he never actually wrote his memoirs.
Right.
That hurt him. You know, a lot of people did. Sherman did, Grant did. They wrote very good books, and they gave Thomas some credit, but of course they still slammed him for being slow and all that stuff. And so in a way, Thomas was kind of kept in the shadow by his early death. Also, after Reconstruction ended in 1877, um, the idea of the Southern Yankee hero was kind of insulting to the Southern mythology of the lost cause and so forth. I mean, the South was obviously not, they were embarrassed by him. They didn't want to even talk about him or even acknowledge him, because it's like, okay, he puts the lie to our patriotism or our supposed patriotism. And then I think the North didn't really put a whole lot of emphasis on Thomas either, because they were, trying to, keep the Union together still. And they thought, okay, let's have a peaceful reconciliation as much as we can. And part of that was that they gave up on Reconstruction and kind of let the South have its own way, mostly after 1877. But, you know, some heroes like Thomas were, like I say, if you emphasize them too much, it just would cause antagonism. So I just kind of let them go. Um, and I hope now, I think like the two recent biographies, and um, I think people are starting to have a little more respect for Thomas. But then, a really good biography of Grant by Ron Charnow.
Mhm.
He uh, he he doesn't really say that much about Thomas, except kind of the same thing. Well, Thomas is a little slow. Grant had to hurry him up, and nah, I don't think it was like that. I understand that if you're writing a long biography of Grant, you can't, you know, go on all these rabbit trails trying to, talk about these other generals too much. You have to kind of focus on your main deal. But I think sometimes Thomas sort of gets still overlooked a little bit. Like they just sort of buy into his reputation as being slow. You know, he was he was deliberate, but he wasn't a slowpoke. So
Slow trot. He's kind
yeah,
of
Float Trot
battled
was
with
his
that.
nickname, and that was just, as you probably know, as from West Point when he was a faculty guy that he's teaching them to ride cavalry horses, and he didn't want them to wear out the horses too quick. So he goes, "Hey, slow trot. Let's don't kill these horses." And then it became just a very negative nickname that he hated, by the way.
Yeah.
So I think
So
he wasn't that vain, but I think he much preferred Rocket Chickamauga or the Sledge of Nashville to being called Slow Trot.
so Conrad, if people want to find your novel, how can they do that?
It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble websites. I think you get both as the book and I believe it's on Kindle or an ebook. So that's available both places. I It may be on some stores. At some stores, I don't know. Maybe in the Houston area, I don't know how. I hope so, but at least it's on the web. So you know, it's not too expensive. $20 and probably $5 delivery. So you know, they I'm not really expecting to make money off this. It was just something to do that is fun. And I hope well that Thomas gets some more respect. So and I'm very grateful to you and some other people for giving me a little exposure and letting people know about the book. So thank you.
Our privilege and our pleasure. I'm glad to give old Thomas a little bit of a recognition myself.
Okay.
So Conrad, thanks for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
So I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.
Thank you.